Have you ever seen a mother's love? Something you thought was sacred, become the broken pieces in a cold, sterile courtroom, amid the silent wooden benches. A mother sat facing her own daughter. The looks they shared were not of love, but of a vast, empty distance. As the gavel was raised, everything seemed to be moving in its expected order. But then, the judge's silence, his unexpected, frozen stillness, made it all come crashing down. A single moment of shock that left everyone in the room holding their breath. If you were in that moment, would you choose to suffer in silence? Or would you speak up to protect what little love was left? Make sure to subscribe to the Deepu Cater Stories channel. Hit the like button and comment with your city to join us on this journey. The Gavel and the Ghost. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 71 years old. How in God's name did I get here? The air in the courtroom is thin and cold, stolen from the lungs of everyone waiting. They say justice is supposed to be blind, but I can feel its eyes on me. Cold, impersonal. The judge lifts the wooden gavel. It hangs in the air. A dark comma in a sentence I am terrified to finish. My daughter, Simone, sits at the table across from me. A stranger in my own blood. She will not meet my gaze. Her hand is a permanent fixture on her pregnant belly. A shield made of flesh and bone. Next to her, Marcus, her husband, stares at me. There's a vulture's patience in his eyes. He is not just waiting for a verdict. He is waiting to feast. The judge, a man named Theodore Hayes, with a crown of silver hair and a weary face, clears his throat. The sound is like gravel scraping stone. He glances down at the document in his hands. A simple motion he has likely made 1,000 times. He begins to read my name aloud. A formality. The petitioner, Marcus Collier, seeks legal guardianship over the respondent, Eleanor Marie. He stops. The word hangs in the air. Unfinished. He doesn't just pause. He freezes. Utterly. The gavel, still held aloft, begins to tremble in his hand. A low murmur ripples through the gallery. The court reporter's fingers hover over her keys. Judge Hayes's face drains of all color. His knuckles are white where he grips the papers. He stares at me. But his eyes are not seeing a 71-year-old woman in a black dress. They are seeing something else. A ghost. Perhaps. He swallows hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Ma'am, he says, his voice a raw, choked whisper that barely carries. He leans forward into his microphone. State your name for the record, please. My lawyer nudges me gently. Eleanor Marie Vance. I say, my own voice sounding distant and fragile. The judge lets out a breath he seems to have been holding for a lifetime. He looks from me to Marcus, to a terrified Simone. His eyes land back on the document, his finger tracing a line of text as if it were written in a foreign language. The whispers in the courtroom grow louder. Marcus is on his feet, his lawyer trying to pull him back down. Your Honor, what is the meaning of this? The judge ignores him. He looks only at me, his gaze burning with a question I never thought I would hear again in my life. Eleanor Marie Vance, he says. The name now a pronouncement. A key turning in a lock rusted shut for decades. The sole executor and primary signatory for the Blackwood Capital Trust. Absolute silence. Then, a gasp from Simone. She drops her pen. It clatters on the floor. Marcus's face is a mask of disbelief, his mouth hanging open. He looks at his wife, then at me, the gears of his greedy mind grinding to a halt, because that name, the Blackwood Capital Trust, was not supposed to exist. Not anymore. It was our family's great secret, the silent, invisible power that my husband, Walter, had managed for the most powerful families in this city. A trust so vast and so discreet, its very existence was a myth whispered in boardroom. And I was the only one left who held the keys. But that is now. In this courtroom where all our ghosts have finally come home to roost, this story, the real one, didn't begin with a thunderclap. It began with a whisper. It began months ago. In my kitchen, with a pot of gumbo and a broken heart. Walter, my husband, used to say gumbo wasn't a meal. It was a testimony to patience, to love, To the quiet strength of family, my cast iron pot had witnessed Simone's whole life. It had seen her laughter, her tears, and the deep, aching quiet after Walter passed that evening. I had spent the entire day cooking for her. For them, the holy trinity of onion, celery, and bell pepper filled the house with a smell of welcome, a smell of love made tangible. Seafood gumbo, her favorite. They arrived late, sorry. Mom, Simone said. A cool kiss brushing my cheek. Work was crazy. Marcus stood behind her. A polite smile fixed on his face. Hands in his pockets. Hello. Mother Eleanor. Never, Mom. Always that careful. Measured distance. It's all right. I said, my own smile feeling brittle. Dinner is ready. I ladled the gumbo into the good china bowls. But as I set the steaming dish before Simone, she pushed it away, just an inch. But it felt like a mile. You didn't have to, she said, her voice flat. We ate on the way. The spoon in my hand felt impossibly heavy. The pot on the stove was still simmering. A day's worth of love going nowhere. Oh, I whispered, we need to talk to you. Eleanor, Marcus said, his voice smooth as oil. It's important. They sat at my table, Walter's table. They spoke of numbers and safety, of burden. They told me this house was too much for me. They said I should sell it, move into a place where I could be managed. I stared at the gumbo, a skin forming over its surface, like a cataract over a dying eye. Memories are in the heart. Mom, Simone recited, the words sounding hollow, like she'd practiced them in the car, not in the walls. I looked at my daughter, my child. I searched her eyes for a flicker of the girl who used to steal shrimp from this very pot. But she was gone. A stranger sat in her place. Simone. Honey? My voice broke. A sound as fragile as old paper. This house is all I have left of your father. It is all I have left of us. She looked away. That night, after they were gone, I didn't touch the dishes. I just sat in the dark kitchen. 2 cold bowls of gummy, 1 full pot, and the silence in the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. It was the silence of a secret waiting to be told. The silence of a ghost about to wake up. The invisible cuts. The days that followed were quiet. A heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. Simone didn't call. I suppose she was giving me space, or perhaps Marcus told her to. He was good at suggesting things, at planting little seeds of doubt and watching them grow in the dark. The first cut was small, so small. I almost didn't feel it. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday morning. I was in the garden with Walter's African violets, my hands deep in the rich, dark soil. I opened the door to find Marcus standing there. Beside him was another man in a cheap suit, holding a clipboard. Morning, Eleanor, Marcus said, with that wide, empty smile of his. This is Mr. Peters. He's just here to take a look around. For the insurance. He didn't wait for my permission. He just stepped aside and let Mr. Peters walk into my home. My home? I stood there by the door, my hands still covered in dirt. And I watched this stranger, this Mr. Peters, walk through my living room. He didn't look at the family photos on the mantle. He didn't notice the worn spot on the rug where Simone took her first steps. He just saw surfaces. He saw square footage. He ran a hand along the wall. Old plaster, he said to Marcus, his voice loud in the quiet house. You'd have to gut this whole section. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. And the plumbing, ancient. Mr. Peters declared. Pipes are probably corroded. Big job. They moved from room to room, their voices echoing. They spoke as if I were a piece of furniture, a part of the house that would be cleared out along with the old pipes and the plaster. I didn't say a word. I just followed them. A ghost in my own home, leaving little smudges of dirt on the doorframes I touched. The second cut was deeper. It was a cut made with a lie. Simone called me a few days later. Her voice was strained, filled with a false, bright concern. Mom, are you okay? I'm fine. Honey. Why? There was a pause. I could hear Marcus whispering in the background. Mom, she said, her voice dropping. Last week, when we were over, you forgot to turn off the gas stove. I froze. The phone pressed against my ear. My mind raced back to that night. The untouched gumbo. The cold kitchen. I remembered every detail. I remembered turning the knob until it clicked. I remembered the little flame dying out. I was sure of it. No. Simone, I said. My voice quiet but firm. I didn't forget. You did. Mom, she insisted. Her voice was pleading now. Marcus and I smelled it. We had to come back in and turn it off after we left. What if something had happened? It's not safe for you to be alone. It was a lie. A clean, perfect lie. A lie designed to make me doubt myself. To make me feel old and forgetful and incompetent. And the worst part was, for a moment, it worked. A cold sliver of fear entered my heart. What if I had forgotten? That fear was exactly what they needed. They came over that weekend. The two of them. This time, they didn't bring an appraiser. They brought a man in a much nicer suit. He introduced himself as their lawyer. He sat on Walter's armchair, looking around my living room with an air of professional sympathy. Simone sat on the edge of the sofa, twisting her hands in her lap. Marcus did all the talking. He spoke about his love for me, his concern for my well-being. He used words like proactive and long-term care. Then, the lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice smooth as oil. Simone and Marcus are deeply concerned. If you are unwilling to consider a voluntary transition into a safer living environment, we may have to explore other legal avenues. I looked at him. What kind of avenues? He let the question hang in the air for a moment. He wanted me to feel the weight of it. For instance, he said finally, a petition for conservatorship based on a determination of mental incapacity. There it was, the final cut. It wasn't a small nick this time. It was a deep, deliberate wound, mental incapacity. They were going to stand up in a court of law and say that my mind was broken, that my memories were faulty, that my love for my own home was a sign of delusion. My own daughter would stand there and agree. I looked at Simone. I searched her face for any sign of protest, any flicker of the girl I raised, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared down at her hands, as if the answer to everything was written there. They wanted to take my home. That, I understood, but to do it, they were willing to take my dignity first. They would strip me of my own mind, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a confused old woman who would sign anything they put in front of her. That night, for the first time since Walter died, I felt a rage building inside me. It started as a low, slow burn in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't the hot, flashy anger of youth. It was an old anger, a cold anger, the kind that settles deep in your bones and waits. Walter's briefcase. The days that followed were gray, not just the sky, but the air I breathed, the food I tasted, the very light that filtered through my windows. It was the color of defeat. Marcus's words from our last phone call echoed in my head. Incapable, unsound mind, for your own good. Eleanor. Each phrase was a stone, building a wall around me. Brick by patient brick. They had their lawyer, they had their plan, and I had a house full of ghosts and a heart full of holes. That evening, I gave up. I truly did. I walked into Walter's study, the one room I had kept exactly as he left it. His reading glasses still rested on an open book. The scent of old paper and his faint, familiar cologne still clung to the air. I didn't go in there for a solution. I went in there to say goodbye. I sank down onto the floor, my back against his heavy oak desk, and let the silence of the room swallow me whole. The fight had gone out of me. They were right. I was just a tired old woman, a burden. The word landed again, not with a crash this time, but with the quiet finality of dust settling on forgotten furniture. I closed my eyes. It was over. My hand rested on the carpet, tracing the pattern of the Persian rug Walter had loved so much. My fingers brushed against something hard and cool beneath the desk's deep knee hole. Leather, old and worn smooth. Curiosity, a feeling I thought had died in me, stirred faintly. I leaned forward, peering into the shadows. It was a briefcase, Walter's old leather briefcase, the one he hadn't used in years. I'd forgotten all about it. It was locked with two small, brass clasps. For a moment, I just stared at it. A relic from a time when my world made sense. I had no reason to open it, but I also had nothing left to lose. I remembered where he kept the tiny key. In the back of his desk drawer, inside a small velvet pouch with his father's cufflink. My fingers trembled as I fumbled with the lock. It clicked open with a soft, metallic sigh. The air that escaped smelled of leather and time. I lifted the lid. There were no stock certificates, no hidden deeds, no secret fortune. There was only a single, thick manila folder. And on the tab, in Walter's neat, deliberate handwriting, were two words: Marcus Collier. My breath caught in my chest. A cold dread, sharp and painful, pierced through the gray numbness. I lifted the folder out. It was heavy, too heavy. I sat there, on the floor of my husband's study, and I began to read. The first page was a report from a private investigator, dated 6 years ago, just 2 weeks after Simone had first introduced Marcus to us. Subject: Marcus Collier. Background check, requested by Walter Vance. My heart hammered against my ribs. Walter. He had never said a word. He had smiled, shaken Marcus's hand, and welcomed him into our home for Sunday dinners. And all the while, he knew something was wrong. He felt it, just as I had. But unlike me, he had acted. I turned the page, and the world I knew fell away. It wasn't just one thing, it was everything. A life built on lies, documented in cold, hard type, casino that, tens of thousands of dollars. Settled just before he married Simone. 2 prior engagements, both broken off after the women signed over significant assets to a joint investment fund. One of them had sued. The case was settled out of court, quietly. His college degree, a fabrication from an unaccredited online university. His job. His position was real, but his impressive performance reviews were based on projects led by others. He was a master of taking credit, page after page. The man my daughter loved was dismantled, piece by piece. He wasn't just a bad man, he was a professional, a predator who sniffed out families with quiet money, with trusting daughters. The final item in the folder was a handwritten note from Walter to himself. It wasn't a letter, it was a list of fears. He isolates her. He talks about money too much. Our money? He looks at this house like he already owns it. She doesn't see it. She's blinded. Protect Eleanor. Find a way. I dropped the folder. The paper spilled onto the rug. All the little red flags I had ignored, all the unsettling moments I had brushed aside, Walter had seen every single one. And he had prepared for a war he never got to fight. He had left me the ammunition. Tears did not come. The gray numbness inside me did not turn into sadness. It ignited. It burned away the weariness, the doubt, the despair. What was left was a pure, cold, clarifying rage. My fear was gone. In its place, a spine of steel grew. Vertebra by vertebra, I was not a victim in my own home. I was a guardian, the last guardian of Walter's legacy. The last protector of the daughter Marcus was trying to devour. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in Walter's chair, with the evidence of Marcus's treachery spread before me. And I felt the ghost of my husband in the room with me. Not a ghost of sadness, but a ghost of strength. I read every page again and again, the words burning themselves into my memory. The fog of my grief and loneliness finally lifted, revealing a battlefield, and for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly what I had to do. Strength isn't always about what you have in the bank. Sometimes, it comes from the truth you are finally willing to face. If you have ever been confronted with a painful truth that changed everything, please share your story in the comments below. We are not alone in our battles. The first move. The sun rose the next morning. But the world felt different. The grief had not gone away. But something new was sitting beside it. Something hard and clear. It was resolve. I did not cry. I made coffee, the same way I have for 40 years, and sat at my kitchen table. I looked at the leather briefcase on the chair opposite me. Walter's last gift. His last line of defense. It was not a treasure map leading to riches. It was a weapon, and I had to learn how to use it. Inside the file, tucked into a side pocket, was an old business card. David Chen, attorney at law. David had been Walter's lawyer for years. A quiet, Meticulous man. I remembered him from the funeral. How he'd held my hand and told me to call if I ever needed anything. I never thought I would. I dialed the number. When his assistant put me through, David's voice was warm and sympathetic. "Eleanor, I am so sorry to hear what you're going through," he began. I cut him off. Gently but firmly. "David," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "I appreciate your sympathy. But I don't need sympathy right now. I need a strategy." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, the warmth in his voice was replaced by a sharp, professional focus. "All right, Eleanor," he said, "tell me everything." And I did. I told him about the gumbo, the appraiser, the gas stove lie, the threat of conservatorship. Then, I told him about the briefcase. We scheduled a meeting for the next day. When I hung up the phone, I felt a stillness inside me I hadn't felt in months. The fear was gone. Now, there was only a plan. But before I saw David, there was one more thing I had to do. This move was not for the lawyer. It was for my daughter. It was for me. I called Simone. "Can you come over?" I asked. My tone was neutral. "I want to talk to you." "Alone." She hesitated. "Marcus thinks it's better if—" "I am not asking Marcus," I said, the steel in my voice surprising even me. "I am asking you, Simone, my daughter, can you come see your mother?" She came an hour later. Looking nervous, she walked into the living room and stood in the middle of the rug, as if she were afraid to sit down. I was already sitting in Walter's armchair. The briefcase was on the floor beside me, but I didn't reach for it yet. "Mom, what is this about?" she asked, twisting the strap of her purse. "I want to show you something," I said. I pulled a single piece of paper from a manila envelope on the side table. It was not from Walter's file. I had asked David to print it for me. It was a public court document, a civil complaint filed 2 years ago in a different county. I held it out to her. "Do you know a woman named Sarah Jensen?" Simone frowned, taking the paper with a hesitant hand. "No." "Should I?" "She knew Marcus," I said quietly. "Before you did." I watched her as she read. Her eyes scanned the page, then scanned it again. I saw the moment she understood. The color drained from her cheeks. The paper was a lawsuit filed by a woman accusing Marcus Collier of defrauding her of her life savings. It detailed a relationship, promises of a future together, and a business investment that vanished along with Marcus. Simone looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief and something else. Fear. This is a lie?" she whispered. "Someone is trying to ruin him." It was settled out of court. "Simone," I said. My voice evened out. "He paid her back a portion of the money to make it go away. It's all in the record." She threw the paper onto the coffee table as if it were on fire. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to hurt him? He loves me. He's not this person. I am not trying to hurt him," I said, and my heart ached as I said it. Because she was my child, and she was in pain. "I am trying to protect you, and I am trying to protect myself." "He's changed," she cried, the tears spilling down her cheeks now. "People can change." "Mom, you don't know him." "Not like I do. He's a good man. He's going to be the father of my child." I looked at my daughter, blinded by what she wanted to believe. She was choosing his story over the truth printed in black and white right in front of her. The seed of doubt was there. I could see it in the panic behind her eyes. But she wasn't ready to let it grow. Not yet. I stood up slowly. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. "I am showing you this for one reason, Simone," I said, my voice low and steady. "I am showing you this so you understand that I will not be sitting quietly in a corner while your husband and his lawyer try to declare me mentally incompetent." I let the words sink in. This is not a game. He has started a war, whether you see it or not. I am not going to lose my home, and I am not going to lose my name. I looked her straight in the eye. "Mother to daughter, I love you more than my own life, but you need to decide which side you are on, because I will not let him take anything else from me, or from you." She just stood there, crying, lost in the space between the man she married and the mother who raised her. When she finally left, she didn't say another word. She didn't have to. I knew I had made my first move, and the board was now set. The line you cannot uncross. A predator, when cornered, does not retreat. It attacks. My quiet warning to Simone, my single piece of evidence laid bare, was not a seed of doubt planted in her mind. It was a threat passed directly to her husband. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He felt his control slipping, and so he escalated. He made his fatal mistake. It arrived on a Tuesday. The mail carrier, a young man named Carlos, who always complimented my azaleas, handed me a stack of letters. Tucked between a grocery store flyer and a bill was a long, cream-colored envelope. It felt heavy in my hand. Official. There was no return address. Just a postmark from the county courthouse. I knew what it was before I opened it. I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table where I had last offered my daughter a meal. My hands were perfectly steady as I slid it open with a butter knife. The paper inside was thick, full of words I didn't need a law degree to understand. Petition for emergency conservatorship. Subject: Eleanor Marie Vance. Reasoning: declining mental state. Paranoia. Inability to manage personal and financial affairs. It was no longer a threat whispered over the phone. It was a declaration of war. Filed. Stamped. Official. Marcus had crossed the line. The one you can never, ever uncross. He was coming for my home. My money. My freedom. And my very name. All of it. I folded the papers neatly and placed them beside the phone. I did not cry. I did not feel fear. I felt a strange and terrible calm. The calm of a ship that has spotted the coming hurricane and has already turned its bow to face the storm. There was no more hoping, no more waiting. There was only the fight ahead. The phone rang an hour later. It was Simone. Her voice was a torrent of panic sobs. Mom? Mom. I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to do this. I swear I didn't. I listened. I let her cry. He said he's doing it for us. She choked out between gasps. To protect me and the baby. He said you're not well, that you're becoming a danger to yourself, and that he's scared. To protect you. The words were so twisted, so poisoned. I almost laughed. I pictured him standing over her as she made the call, coaching her, feeding her the lies he wanted me to swallow. Protect you, Simona Verst asked, and my voice was not the voice of her mother. It was the voice of the woman who now sat in Walter Vance's chair. It was quiet. It was cold. It was unbreakable. Protect you by putting your own mother in a legal cage, I continued. By stripping away everything she has, everything your father and I built for you. By telling the world she is crazy so he can get his hands on her home. Her sobbing hitched. But he loves me. This is not love. Simone, I said, and the words were sharp and final. This is conquest. Your husband has declared war on me. On this family. I paused, letting the silence stretch between us. A tight wire of truth, and I will not lose. I hung up the phone. There was nothing more to say. The time for words was over. The next day, I was in my lawyer's office. Mrs. Davis, the woman Walter's note had recommended, had eyes as sharp as her mind. She spread the court documents out on her polished mahogany desk. Beside them, I placed Walter's briefcase. I opened it. This, I said, pushing the thick manila folder across the desk, is our defense, and this is our weapon. She spent the next hour reading. I watched her face. Her professional calm slowly morphed into a look of quiet, focused fury. She read every page, every settled lawsuit, every casino marker, every lie Marcus had ever told. When she was finished, she closed the folder and looked at me. For the first time, she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a hunter who has just been handed a map to her prey's den. Well, Eleanor, she said, her voice crisp. Mr. Collier wanted to put you on trial. She tapped the folder with a single, manicured finger. I think it's time we put him on trial instead. We sat there together, two women in a quiet office, with a dead man's love and foresight spread out on the table between us. We began to arrange the papers. We began to build our case, and as I looked at the evidence of Marcus Collier's wicked life, I felt no hatred. I felt nothing at all for him. All I felt was a deep resolve, the quiet, powerful certainty of a woman who knows she is on the right side of history. It was time for the world to know who Marcus Collier really was. The stillness before the storm. The night before the hearing, I did not sleep. Sleep felt like a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I walked through my house. The house they wanted to take. I walked not as its owner, but as a historian, a keeper of memories. Each floorboard creaked with a familiar song. I ran my hand along the wallpaper in the hallway. The tiny faded blue flowers that Simone used to trace with her finger as a little girl. I paused at the bottom of the staircase and looked up. And for a moment, I could almost see Walter coming down, his reading glasses perched on his nose, a book tucked under his arm. The house was not just wood and plaster. It was a living thing, breathing with the echoes of our lives. I ended up in Walter's armchair. It faced the large window overlooking the garden. In the pale moonlight, the African violets on the sill were just dark, velvety shapes. His flowers, his chair, his quiet strength that still lingered in the room like the scent of old books and pipe tobacco. I closed my eyes and I spoke to him. Not out loud, just in the quiet of my own heart. "Walter, what do I do?" I asked the silent. "They are trying to say I am not me anymore." And in that quiet, his voice came back to me, not as a memory, but as a truth I had carried inside me all along. I remembered a conversation we'd had years ago, sitting right here in this room. Simone was in college, and Walter had just set up his scholarship fund. I had asked him why he put so much of our savings into it. Instead of investing it for ourselves, he had taken my hand. His hands were always so warm. "Eleanor," he'd said, his voice gentle and sure. "Money is just a tool. It builds things. It buys things. But it has no memory. It has no honor. The real inheritance, the only one that matters, is the name we leave behind. The integrity of it. The integrity of it." The words settled over me. A blanket of calm. I wasn't fighting for a house. I wasn't fighting over money. I was fighting for the integrity of Walter's name. Of my name. I was fighting for the truth. And the truth, I realized, was not something that could be taken from me. It could only be given away. And I would not give it away. The anger I had felt for weeks, that cold, hard knot in my chest, finally dissolved. It wasn't anger I needed for tomorrow. It was strength. The quiet strength of a root that holds firm in the storm. I must have sat there for hours, just breathing, just being. Sometime before dawn, I went upstairs. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself. I saw the lines around my eyes, the silver in my hair. I saw a 71-year-old woman, but for the first time in a long time, I did not see someone old or frail. I saw a survivor. I saw Walter's wife. I saw Simone's mother. Tomorrow. I whispered to the woman in the mirror, my voice steady in the quiet room. Tomorrow. They will learn the name Eleanor Vance. Just as the first light began to filter through the window, the phone rang. The sound was jarring in the stillness. My heart leaped into my throat. It was Simone. I answered. "Hello." For a long moment, there was only the sound of her breathing on the other end. It was ragged, like she'd been crying. I waited. Then, one word came through the line. A whisper. "Mom," she said. Her voice choked with a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. "I'm sorry." And then she hung up. I stood there, holding the phone, listening to the dial tone. It was not a promise. It was not a plan. But it was a crack in the wall they had built between us. It was a flicker of light in the dark, and it was enough. The shock in the courtroom. The courtroom felt like a theater built for a tragedy. Marcus's lawyer was on stage, and he was giving the performance of a lifetime. He painted a picture of a devoted son-in-law, a man desperate to protect his fragile, pregnant wife from her own mother, a mother, he claimed, who was lost in a fog of grief and paranoia. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "is not a bad person. She is a sick person, a woman who, tragically, has begun to invent conspiracies, to see enemies where there are none. A woman who is emotionally abusing her only daughter, threatening the stability of her marriage and the health of her unborn grandchild." I sat perfectly still in my chair. I did not flinch. I just listened to the lies, each one a carefully chosen stone being used to build my prison. I could feel the jury's eyes on me, their expressions shifting from neutrality to pity. They were beginning to believe him. I could see Simone across the room, weeping silently into a handkerchief, playing her part in this sad, ugly play. Then, it was my turn. The defense calls Eleanor Marie Vance to the stand. My lawyer, Mrs. Davis, announced. I stood up. My knees felt steady. I walked to the witness stand. My footsteps, the only sound in the silent room. I sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at the judge. His name was Theodore Hayes, a man with tired eyes. He cleared his throat and looked down at the document in his hands. The official petition to have me declared incompetent. State your full name for the record, please, he said. The words a standard, monotonous ritual. Eleanor Marie Vance. I said, my voice clear and then it happened. The change was almost imperceptible at first. A slight stiffening of his shoulders. He stopped shuffling his papers. He slowly, very slowly, lifted his head. His eyes, no longer tired, were wide and fixed on my face. The professional mask he wore had vanished. A low murmur started in the back of the courtroom. Judge Hayes didn't seem to notice. He looked from my face, down to the name on the paper, and back up again. He swallowed, the motion sharp and visible in his throat. Forgive me, he said, his voice quiet, all pretense of judicial procedure gone. He was no longer a judge speaking to a respondent. He was a man speaking to a memory, Eleanor Marie Vance. From Cedar Street, wife of the late Walter Vance. My heart, which had been beating a slow, steady rhythm of resolve, gave a painful lurch. Yes, I whispered. The judge leaned back in his chair as if struck. He ran a hand over his face. He looked at Marcus, whose confident smirk was beginning to falter. He looked at Simone, whose crying had stopped, her face a mask of confusion. Your Honor? Marcus's lawyer interjected, sensing a loss of control. Is this relevant? Judge Hayes held up a hand to silence him, never taking his eyes off me. This court, he began, his voice now filled with a strange, solemn weight, has a duty to declare any potential conflict of interest. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. I cannot, in good conscience, preside over this case without making a full disclosure. He took a deep breath. 30 years ago, I was a young man from a poor family, struggling to get through law school. My father had just passed away. I was broke, and I was about to drop out. The entire courtroom was leaning forward, hanging on his every word. That year, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, I became one of the first recipients of a new, anonymous scholarship, a full ride, given to students of promise who had no other means. A scholarship that saved my career, that saved my life. He looked directly at me. No one else in the room existed. That scholarship, ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice ringing with a power that had nothing to do with his gavel, was called the Vance Young Leaders Scholarship. It was founded by the man this petitioner claims was financially inept, Mr. Walter Vance, and it was administered, with grace and kindness, by his wife. He nodded at me. Mrs. Eleanor Vance. A collective gasp went through the room. Marcus's face was ashen. The color had not just drained from it. It looked like it had been violently ripped away. Simone stared at me, her mouth agape, as if seeing me for the first time. Her husband, the devoted son-in-law. Her mother, the paranoid old woman. The entire narrative he had built for her crumbled to dust in a stunning moment. My lawyer, Mrs. Davis, simply smiled. The courtroom was utterly silent. Every person in that room holding their breath. In that moment, I was not a sick old woman fighting for her freedom. I was a part of Walter's legacy. A legacy of kindness, of quiet strength, of lifting others up. Justice, I realized, sometimes comes not from a gavel, but from the seeds of goodness you planted long ago, in a garden you forgot you ever tended. If you are still listening, please help me by commenting the number 1 below, so I know that I still have friends walking with me on this journey. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to continue telling the final part of my life story. The unmasking. Judge Hayes took a long, slow breath, the sound barely audible in the tense silence. He carefully removed his glasses and placed them on the polished wood of his bench. When he looked up, the tiredness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a focused, penetrating clarity. He looked at Marcus and his lawyer, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The tired man was gone. In his place was a judge. "Mr. Collier," he said, his voice dangerously calm, almost conversational. "Given this revelation about the Vance family's long-standing commitment to the legal community of this city, you still wish to proceed with your petition to declare your mother-in-law mentally incompetent." Marcus's lawyer, a man who had been swimming in confidence just minutes before, was now treading water. He shot to his feet, a little too quickly. "Yes, Your Honor, absolutely," he stammered, smoothing down his tie. "My client's deep concern for Mrs. Vance's well-being is, of course, entirely separate from any past charitable works of her late husband." A faint, sad smile touched the judge's lips, a look that said he had seen this kind of desperate maneuvering 1,000 times before. "Very well," he said, the politeness in his tone making the words feel sharper. "Then let us proceed. Mr. Chen, you may call your first witness." But David Chen, my lawyer, did not call anyone to the stand. He simply walked to his table with a quiet deliberation. He lifted a worn, leather briefcase, Walter's briefcase. He walked to the central evidence table and placed it down, not with a loud bang, but with a soft, respectful thud that seemed to carry all the weight of the years it had been kept hidden. "Your Honor," David said, his voice steady and clear, filling the silent room, "we do not need witnesses. Mrs. Vance's character has already been established. What we need is documentation." And then he unlatched the two brass clasps. The sound echoed like a pair of gunshots in the quiet. He opened the briefcase. What followed was not a battle. It was a dismantling, a careful, methodical unmasking, piece by piece. David laid out the hidden life of Marcus Collier on the pristine surface of the evidence table. He did not rush. He let each piece of evidence breathe, letting its poison seep into the air of the courtroom. He presented copies of bank statements from 3 different states, a roadmap of staggering gambling debts paid off with mysterious infusions of cash. He produced sworn, notarized affidavits from 2 other women, a schoolteacher from Ohio, a retired nurse from Florida. Their stories were eerily similar, each one a sad testament to Marcus's practiced charm, his promises of a shared future, and the once-in-a-lifetime business opportunity that had ended with their savings accounts emptied. He then presented the crown jewel, the final report from the private investigator Walter had hired. It contained phone record, travel itineraries, and a chillingly detailed timeline. It proved, beyond any doubt, that Marcus had hired his own investigator to look into my family's financial standing before he had even taken Simone on their second date. It had never been about love. It had always been a hunt. I watched Marcus. He did not fidget. He did not protest. He sat perfectly still, as if he were carved from stone. His face was a frozen mask of detached disbelief, the look of a man watching his own house burn down on the evening news, unable to connect the televised disaster with the warm home he had left that morning. The charming, concerned son-in-law had evaporated. All that was left was a hollow, desperate stranger. Then David Chen paused. He had laid out all the pieces. Now, it was time for the final move. He looked over at my daughter. "Your Honor," he said gently, "the petitioner, Mr. Collier, has based his entire case on one single claim that his wife, Mrs. Simone Collier, believes her mother to be mentally incompetent and a danger to herself. With the court's permission, I would like to ask Mrs. Collier one question." Judge Hayes nodded slowly. "Mrs. Collier, please rise." Simone stood up. Her movements were slow, heavy, as if the weight of the truth were physically holding her down. She held onto the table for support, her knuckles white. She did not look at me. She did not look at the judge. She looked only at her husband, and in her eyes, I saw a terrible storm of heartbreak and a dawning, brutal clarity. "Mrs. Collier," David asked, his voice kind but relentlessly clear, "do you believe your mother, Eleanor Vance, is mentally incompetent?" The room was so quiet I could hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus stared at her, his eyes narrowed into slits, a look of pure command. He was willing her to say the words they had rehearsed, to stick to the script, to save him. Simone took a shaky breath. She turned her head, slowly. And for the first time that day, her eyes met mine. Her face was a landscape of pain, streaked with tears. But these were not the tears of a frightened, confused child. They were the tears of a woman who was finally, horribly, awake. "No," she said. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried across the courtroom like a shout. She took another breath, drawing strength from some hidden place deep inside. "No. My mother is the strongest person I know." She turned her gaze back to Marcus, and the love that had once been in her eyes was now replaced with the ashes of betrayal. "I was wrong," she said, her voice growing louder, each word a painful stone being pulled from the foundation of her life. "I was wrong to listen. I was wrong to believe a liar." Marcus flinched as if he'd been physically struck. The mask finally, completely shattered. "Simone, don't," he hissed, the sound venomous and desperate in the quiet room. Silence. "Mr. Collier," Judge Hayes commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. I did not feel a rush of victory. I did not feel triumphant. Watching my daughter publicly tear down the life she had built, renouncing the man she loved, the father of her unborn child, brought me no joy. I only felt a profound, aching sadness for her, for the terrible, lonely pain she had to walk through to find her way back to the light. Judge Hayes looked down from his bench. His face was a mask of cold, judicial fury. He spoke directly to Marcus, his voice low and cutting, each word a judgment in itself. "Mr. Collier, this petition is not just dismissed," he said. "It is an insult to this court. It is a disgusting and calculated abuse of the legal system. It is a cruel and predatory attempt to defraud and silence an honorable woman. A woman whose family has done more for justice in this city than you could comprehend in 1,000 lifetimes." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Marcus. "A permanent restraining order is hereby issued. You will not come within 500 feet of Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Furthermore, I am referring this entire case file, including the damning evidence presented by Mr. Chen, to the district attorney's office for immediate investigation into multiple counts of criminal fraud." He reached for the gavel. This time, I heard it. It was sharp. It was clean, and it was the sound of a cage door, one I didn't even know I was in, finally swinging open. The road to healing. Victory in a courtroom does not feel like victory. It feels like silence after a terrible storm. The debris is everywhere, and you are left standing in the wreckage, wondering how to begin to rebuild. Marcus was gone from our lives. His name became a whisper, then a memory, then nothing at all. He faced his own legal battles after the trial, a mess of his own making that I no longer paid any mind to. My war was over. But the peace was harder to find. Simone moved back into her childhood bedroom. For the first few weeks, we were like two polite ghosts haunting the same house. We passed each other in the hallway with quiet good mornings and good nights. I cooked for her, making sure she ate well for the baby, and she would wash the dishes without being asked. But between us lay the silent landscape of hurt. Her betrayal was a wound that had closed over but still ached with the memory of the blade. Forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It's a road you decide to walk, one painful step at a time. And we knew we couldn't walk it alone. Our first therapy session was excruciating. We sat in two comfortable armchairs that felt miles apart. The therapist, a kind woman with gentle eyes, asked Simone why she was there. "I hurt my mother," Simone whispered, her eyes fixed on her own hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "I broke her trust. I chose a monster over her, and I don't know how to fix it." Then the therapist looked at me. "And you, Eleanor." I took a breath. I want my daughter back, I said, the simple truth of it making my voice thick. But I am afraid of the woman she became. It was the first time the truth had been spoken so plainly between us. It was ugly, and it was painful, but it was real, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like we were standing on solid ground. The sessions continued. Week after week, we unraveled the years of lies Marcus had spun, the subtle ways he had isolated Simone, turning her insecurities into weapons against her own family. She spoke of her shame, her guilt, her fear of not being a good enough wife, a good enough daughter, and I spoke of my loneliness, my fear of being a burden, and the deep, abiding grief of feeling abandoned by my only child. Slowly, carefully, we began to build a bridge back to each other across that silent landscape of pain. In the midst of our own healing, I knew Walter's legacy couldn't end with a courtroom victory. His foresight had saved me. Now, it had to save others. I met with the board of the Vance Foundation. I told them my story, and with their blessing, we established a new branch. We called it the Senior Justice Project. Its mission was simple: to provide free legal aid to elderly people who were being financially abused or exploited by their own families. The first call we received from a terrified man whose grandchildren were trying to sell his house out from under him affirmed that our work had just begun. One sunny afternoon, a few months after the trial, I was in the garden, tending to Walter's African violet. They were blooming, their purple heads a testament to quiet resilience. I heard the back door slide open. Simone walked out, carrying something carefully in her hands. It was a small terracotta pot. Inside was a young African violet, its leaves green and hopeful. She set it down next to Walter's collection. She didn't say anything for a long moment. "I know it doesn't fix anything," she finally whispered, her voice fragile, "but I wanted to add something back. Instead of just taking away." I looked at the small, new plant. Then I looked at my daughter, her belly round with new life, her eyes clear of the shadows that had haunted them for so long. The wound in my heart, the one that had ached for months, eased. It was not gone. But for the first time, it felt like it might one day heal completely. I reached out and placed my hand over hers, our fingers resting together on the cool clay of the pot. "It's a start," I said, and it was. It was the beginning of a new spring. The Garden of Legacy. It has been 5 years since the sound of a gavel marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. My garden is my sanctuary now. The world outside can be loud, but here, there is only the gentle hum of bees and the rustle of leaves in the Georgia breeze. In my arms, I hold my granddaughter. Her name is Hope. She is 4 years old. With Walter's wide, curious eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, she is a creature of sunlight and laughter. And she is the beat of my healed heart. "Grandma Ellie," she says, her small finger tracing the velvety petal of an African violet. "Tell me the story of the strong flower again." It's her favorite story, a simpler version of my own. A story about a little flower that a big, greedy weed tried to crowd out. But the flower had deep roots and the sun remembered its name, so it grew strong and tall. I begin the story, my voice a low, familiar hum. Simone is sitting with us on the porch steps, sketching in a notebook. She is a different woman now. The shadows in her eyes are gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. After Hope was born, she went back to school, got her paralegal certificate, and now she is the heart of the Senior Justice Project. She talks to the frightened old women, the confused old men. She holds their hands and tells them, "I understand. You are not alone." She has turned her deepest shame into her greatest strength. As I tell Hope about the flower's deep roots, I look at Simone. I realize the greatest love a parent can give is not to shield their child from every storm, but to teach them how to stand on their own after the storm has passed. For too long, my love for Simone was a blanket. It kept her warm, but it also kept her from growing the strength she needed to face the cold. My sacrifice should have come with lessons in resilience, not just unconditional comfort. That was the lesson I had to learn. Simone catches my eye and smiles. A real, easy smile that reaches her eyes. She has learned her own lesson. She knows now that devotion to a spouse does not require the abandonment of a parent. That true partnership doesn't demand you erase your own history. She learned that loyalty is not blindness. It is the courage to see the truth and to protect the family that raised you from those who would harm it. That is the lesson for the sons and daughters. Hope giggles as I get to the part where the sun shines on the little flower. Her joy is so pure, so simple. It is the future. It is the reason we fight the battles we must. And I, Eleanor Vance, have learned the final, greatest lesson of all. In this modern world, a world that moves so fast it often forgets to look back. A world where the elderly can become invisible, their wisdom mistaken for weakness. Our greatest power is not in what we own. It is not in a bank account or a secret trust. Our power is in our stories. It is in the wisdom etched into our faces, in the strength fortified by our heartbreaks, and in the courage to speak our truth, even when our voices shake. A true legacy is not what you leave behind in a will. It is the impact you have on the lives you touch while you are still here. It is the battles you fight, not just for yourself, but for those who cannot fight for themselves. It is the act of living with dignity and purpose until your very last breath. And the flower lived happily ever after, Hope asks, her head resting sleepily on my shoulder. I kiss the top of her head, inhaling the sweet scent of sunshine and childhood. Yes, my love, I whisper. The strong flower lived a very happy, very peaceful life, and it is true, here, in my garden, surrounded by the quiet, resilient beauty of Walter's violets. With my strong daughter beside me and my precious granddaughter in my arm, I have found my peace. It is not the empty peace of silence. It is not the hollow peace of a life untouched by sorrow. It is the peace of a warrior, resting after the war is won. The mask is shattered, and the truth is set free. Eleanor Vance's story is now a part of our own, but it makes you question, doesn't it? How many other secrets are hidden in plain sight? How many ordinary people are carrying extraordinary histories? Eleanor chose to fight with strategy and honor. What would your weapon of choice have been? I'm fascinated to read your perspective. Leave your theory, your feelings, your what if in the comments below. If you felt that chill of revelation, that spark of justice, help it spread by giving this video a like and sharing it. To make sure you're here for the next secret we unlock, hit subscribe and join us at Deepu Cater Stories. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the quietest people have the most powerful stories to tell. See you next time.